Hello everyone and welcome to this overview of layers in Photoshop. I just want to start off by saying that layers probably are the single most important thing you are going to be working with in Photoshop this semester. So yeah, that means this lesson is fairly important. Although this lesson is really just an intro. I'm not going to get into details and specifics on certain layer attributes because there's not time for it here, and also it would just be too much for you to absorb in one lesson. So my goal here is to get you acquainted with layers, hopefully get you comfortable with the different aspects, and give you an overview so that when you do see these in action, these different attributes of layers in action as we go through the lessons, you won't be completely lost. You'll have hopefully an understanding of what they mean and how to utilize them. So, of course, as with all lessons, I'm going to make a strong effort to explain everything I'm doing and to make sure you understand the logic and the workflow logic of what I'm doing. That I think is one of the key elements of learning from video as opposed to learning from a textbook. But that said, I do think you need a strong overview at the beginning to understand why I would choose to do something a certain way. And so I'm hoping that this lesson will start that process. Let me preface this again by saying that the icons that I show you here in the layers panel may look very different than the Photoshop version that you're using. And that is something that is really part of this course. It's part of learning Photoshop. It's part of working with any software tool, but especially Adobe software. You are never going to see the end of Photoshop versions being released. They're going to constantly come out. You know, it's like if you're a comic book collector, think of it as new editions of the comic, only instead of new stories, they just move stuff around on you. So you can never allow your mindset to be, well, it doesn't look like mine, therefore I can't learn it. If you go down that path, you'll never recover from it. And to be honest with you, by the time I've recorded this and put this out, even if I did it 2 weeks ago, there may be a new version out there. The good news is the icons themselves, the shapes, the symbols, and all of that you're going to see here, doesn't change. They're still the same. I'm sure of it. I can't predict the future, but I've seen what Adobe's done over the last 20 years, and most of these icons really haven't changed. They still look as they always have when they were created. It's just they move them around. They might put them in a slightly different order or, things of that nature. But once again, if you do get lost and you really can't find something or don't understand something, then just email me and we'll figure it out and I'll help you out. No, that's what I'm here for. Okay, so let's get back to layers. I've opened up the fijianvillage.psd file that you have in your folder, and you can really use any folder, any file for this lesson to get started, but you'll notice that this file, like most things, whether it's a photo from your cell phone, a JPEG that you've downloaded from the internet, or a photo from one of your cameras, chances are it's a single layer element that you're bringing into Photoshop, okay? So what are layers? How do they work? And why are they so important? First off, if I open up this photo, let's say I just took it with my camera and I start using my tools here in Photoshop to edit this photograph and change it, I'm damaging those pixels. I'm destroying that data. Okay, that's my original. And yes, I could always hit don't save or something of that nature, but that's not really a good workflow. You want to protect yourself by always safeguarding and working with copies. So that's the first thing we're going to do in here. We're going to copy a layer. This is what's called the background layer, my first layer. And we're going to go ahead, in fact, in your version of Photoshop, in your photo, it may be labeled as background layer. But let's go ahead and drag this one. In my case, it's called layer 1. I'm going to drag this layer down to this thing that looks like a notepad, this little button, and I'm just dragging this down with my mouse, my left mouse button, and when I let go of my mouse button, it will duplicate that layer, and it basically works like a little copy machine, and it has named this after the first layer. So yours might say background layer copy, for example. I'm just going to change this name. I can do this with any layer at any time. I'm on a Mac here, so I'm double clicking here, but just be patient. Click on the text and you should be able to edit it. So I'm going to go ahead and just call this village photo. You know, maybe I'm building a poster and this is just going to be one photo element of that poster. Who knows? But what I like to do when I make a copy is I like to turn off the original or disable it somehow. So you'll notice there's these eyeball icons on the left of your layer preview, and that simply means it's visible or not visible. So if I were to turn them both off, for example, then I've turned off the visibility of both of my layers. So what I sometimes will do if I'm in a hurry and I don't want to use the locking features, or I'm just lazy, sometimes I'll just turn it off so I can't see it. So out of sight, out of mind, chances are I won't edit it. But that's not the safest means of protecting a layer. The safest means, if you really want to protect something, is to actually lock it. So let's talk about these locking mechanisms and how they work. First off, if I just want to lock down an entire layer, I can click on the padlock. And that locks all attributes. It puts a little padlock on there. You notice now I have a little no symbol when my cursor comes over the photo. I can't actually do anything to it. If I were to try, it simply would give me an error message and it would say something like this: could not use the brush tool because the layer is locked. All right, so what if you don't want to lock all attributes, just certain ones? Well, there's options for that. So here's lock position. If I were to use the move tool and try and move my image, it would give me a message saying, oops, you could not use the move tool because the layer is locked. But something else, like maybe painting it, is not a problem. I am able to do that. So I'm going to undo this. But just to show you, yeah, you can lock certain mechanisms. Here's the paintbrush. So now I can't paint. I got the no symbol on my paintbrush. And I can't move it either. So I get the same error message. So you get the idea. You can lock attributes. One nice feature is that you could lock transparency of a layer if you want to edit using that mechanism. I'll give you an example. So to do that, I'm going to create a new layer. And I realize I'm going kind of fast with some of these tools, but again, remember, I'm just trying to give you an overview of how layers work and how they're going to be beneficial to you. So if you don't catch all this that I'm doing, that's fine. I'm not asking you to turn this in. I'm just asking you to follow along as best you can. Because again, it's going to take time for you to get familiar with these tools. You haven't got to that point yet. At this point, I'm just trying to give you an overview. So here's an overview. Let me just go ahead and make a new layer. I do that by clicking the new layer button. This is the same notepad button I used a moment ago to copy the first layer here, just by dragging it. Instead of dragging it, I'm just clicking on it. And it creates, as you can see, a brand new empty blank layer. Okay, that's what that checkerboard pattern means that you saw earlier. That just means it's empty. So I can call this something. Let's give it a name. I'll call this my shape layer. You can name things anything you want, obviously. It's whatever works for you. I'm going to take the shape tool and just create like a simple shape here. So I've got my fleur-de-lis shape set up, but there's some presets you can use. Again, if you're not familiar with these tools yet, that's fine. You don't have to do this part of it. I'm just follow along, watch what I'm doing so you understand. All right, so here's a shape. And in terms of locking the transparency, you'll notice over here, you can see that the checkerboard pattern around the fleur-de-lis shape is just that. It's transparent. It's nothing there. So I can move this around with my move tool, but I'm looking straight through back to the layer below it, which also points out the obvious fact that when you stack layers on top of each other, it's just like stacking pieces of paper or stacking transparencies or stacking a deck of cards. Whatever's on top is going to cover whatever's below, as long as it's 100% opaque. If it's, in this case, transparent and opaque, then the areas that are transparent are going to show through. All right, so let's say, for example, I lock the transparency. What does that mean? Well, if I take the paintbrush, let's go ahead and change the color here to something like red. Just changing this, my color picker, nothing fancy. I'm just going to paint this. You'll notice now I can paint the fleur-de-lis red because I've locked the transparent pixels so they're not editable. I can't paint the transparent pixels even if I try. It doesn't let me do that. But it does let me paint the opaque pixels. Okay, so that's how this transparent lock feature works. It lets you edit only the pixels that are not transparent. So if I were to turn this off, I could then edit again. All right, so that gives you some idea, hopefully, of how locking can benefit you in Photoshop. All right, then, so let's go and talk a little bit about this stacking process. Blending, which is this middle column here, is defined into two different areas. First, you have your blend modes on the left, and there's a long list, and we're not going to talk about these today on this lesson. These are ways that layers interact with each other, the stacking of layers, and we're going to get into the specifics of these different modes, many of them in subsequent lessons, and where it'll make sense. But to try and address them now would just be a real source of confusion for you, so we're not going to do that. The opacity slider is a little bit easier to understand. It's simple. It simply means how opaque your layer is. So if you want to fade this out, semi-transparent, you can choose whatever layer of level of opacity works for you. Okay, so let's talk a little bit now about these buttons here. We started off with the most important one, create a new layer button, okay? The one that looks like a notepad, the one that looks like kind of a stack of sticky notes. All right, next to that, you've got what's supposed to be a trash can. I don't hope it looks like one, but that should be familiar to you. If you're a Mac or a PC user, you should know what a trash can is. And it functions just like a trash can would on your operating system. You can drag a layer into it, and it will erase that layer. I'm going to undo that. But yeah, that's as simple as that. It erases layers. Next up, you've got a folder, which looks much like the folders on your Mac or your PC. In this case, Photoshop calls them a group. Okay, so when you click on that, you get a new group. All right, well, folders in Photoshop function much like they do in your operating system. You can name them, and we'll call this one shape group, for lack of a better name. And I'm going to go ahead and make some shapes and put it in there. I've only got one shape layer, so let's change that. I'm going to duplicate this as I did before and make two shape layers. And maybe to differentiate this one, I'll just lock that transparency and paint this one black so that it looks a little different so you can tell which is which. And maybe instead of calling it shape layer copy, a better name might be shape layer black instead of red. So there we go. We'll go with that. But I'm going to turn off the transparency lock. And now you'll notice that the folder is open, but there's nothing in it. So I'm going to drag up each of these layers one by one, and I'm just going to stick them in that folder. And you'll notice when I do that, it indents them. So it lets me know that they're collapsible. I can go ahead and open this or close it with a triangle. This functions much like it would in your operating system, whether you're a Mac or a PC person. It's just used for grouping. Why is that useful? Well, right now we've only got a few layers, so things are pretty simple. But imagine having 50 layers in your document and trying to organize things. You're going to need folders, trust me. The other thing that I want to point out to you is that by grouping things, you're going to save a lot of time when you have complex jobs. So let's say, for example, you've got a design made up of several of these shapes, and you've got some kind of thing going on with the red one and the black one. You notice that I can edit these separately with the move tool if I'm selecting them inside of the folder. But when I select the folder as a group, then they come together. So that saves me time if I want to move those together as a group, okay? Let's say I wanted to duplicate this and make a lot of them quickly. So I can drag this folder down to the new layer button. Just as I duplicated the single layers, I can duplicate groups of layers now. And so now I've got two. I've got the shape group copy and I've got the original shape group. and I can turn off the visibility of one folder and leave the other one. And so you can start to see how complex things can get very quickly. I'm going to drag this into the trash just to simplify things. But yeah, you can start to multiply complex groupings of layers together for your design element. And the sooner you start to use features like that, the easier it will be to work with design elements in Photoshop. Okay, especially with graphic design when you've got text elements, paragraphs, maybe logo types, multiple photographs, all kinds of things you're dealing with. You really need to understand and be able to take advantage of these layer features. Okay, so that's a group. And again, it's a great space saver as well. You notice when I take those layers away, it just cleans up the interface and lets me not worry about them so much as far as the cluttering of the layers palette. Okay, so next to that, we've got our specialized types of layers. Okay, this first one is called the adjustment layer. Okay, the adjustment layer set, when you click on it, here's a sampling of the menu there. Those options offer a wide variety of things that you can do to affect layers. All right, so let me give you a quick example. Again, this is stuff that we're going to get into as we go through the semester. I'm not here to try and get you to understand every one of these. We simply don't have time, and it would confuse you if I did. But I just want you to understand the concept of how an adjustment layer works and interacts with other layers. So let's choose a simple one. I'll go with, let's say, for example, black and white. All right. Now, it may not look so simple on all these sliders and all these controls, but again, I'm not going to get into that right now. We just don't have time. But just know that the properties are very customizable, and I can start to tweak the way that my image gets converted into black and white by using these sliders. And it can be, it's very detailed, but it's also gives you a lot of control over your photos. All right, I'm going to collapse this by hitting this little arrow button so it stays out of the way. And here's what it looks like. So now I've got the black and white. It's been named. It's an adjustment layer. And this is the icon for this particular one. And you notice it's like this sort of rectangle that's been divided in half. That's the icon we have. And just like other regular layers, I can turn on and off the visibility. So if I want to see what my image looks like in color, I just turn off the black and white adjustment. Okay. All this thing is doing is it's casting a black and white effect over everything that's below it. Again, remember, Photoshop layers work with stacking. So anything that's on top is going to affect what's below. If I was to drag this layer down below the color photograph, it's no longer having an effect because it's below the photograph. Okay, so you have to remember stacking is in order. So I'm going to put it back on top. I'm just going to drag this up and let it go up here. So now it's on top of everything, including my shape group. Okay, so it's also affecting, don't forget, these. All right, so an adjustment layer, as I said, can be turned on and off, the visibility to see back and forth, but it also interacts with all these other elements. Say, for example, opacity. If I only want to make it semi black and white, I can leave some of the color elements in there by reducing the opacity slider just a little bit. Or I can add more color, so this can give me a way I can control the amount of this adjustment layer and how it's interacting with the others. So you can start to see already, hopefully, the creative potential for using an adjustment layer. And this is just one of many, remember. So it behaves just like other layers. And you can start to see, hopefully, the beauty of layers is that they're non-destructive. They give me so many options to change my mind. If a client changes their mind on their design and you says, no, I want this in color, no, I want this to move over this way, that way, layers will save you every time because layers give you that opportunity to change your mind as whenever you need to. When I open up save this Photoshop file with layers intact and I reopen it later, all of these layers are still going to be there. I can still come back and edit this anytime I need to and make adjustments to these layers. So it's really, really handy, and it's gonna, in some cases, it may really save your life and your workflow. Okay, so let's move on. You'll notice there's this big white panel, and this comes standard with every adjustment layer. This is basically called a mask, okay? And this mask element will allow you to hide or reveal certain aspects, certain elements of this layer group. So I'm going to prove that. I'm going to take the paint tool and I'm going to paint black on this white area, and you'll see that the color comes back. Okay, and wherever I paint black, that color is then revealed. So basically this is affecting the opacity, affecting the transparency by using pixels, by using color, or in this case, grayscale actually. So, we have roughly 256 levels of gray that we can work with. So I can, choose, instead of solid black, I could choose like a middle gray, and that would give me a different level of effect when it comes to painting. So you can start to see even more potential with these masks. These are called layer masks, and they're really, really handy. If you make a mistake or you want to get rid of one, you can actually disable these, or you can delete them altogether if you just don't want to mess with it. You don't want to have it. And then you notice I no longer have the mask. It's just the black and white adjustment layer. So again, we're going to dig deep into use this, and trust me, we're going to use these features multiple times throughout the semester. But again, I just want you to have an understanding here at the beginning of how these things work. So let me go ahead and trash this adjustment layer. And let's move now on to the next category. So these are the layer masks that you can add to any of your existing layers. I just showed you what a layer mask does. But now just realize that you can go ahead and add layer masks to any existing layer. So say, for example, my shape group. Let's go ahead and try that. I'm going to add a layer mask to the entire group, which means that both red and black are going to be affected by it. So when I go ahead and paint now, it's going to paint transparency through those elements. You notice that there's my gray, and there's exactly where the transparent element comes into play. And I'm going to dial this up to a darker color like black, and now they disappear completely. Okay, so that should give you some idea of how layer masks work and how they can work for you. But again, yes, we will use these quite extensively. To get rid of it, I'm just going to drag it to the trash and say, do I want to delete the layer mask? I say, yes, I do. All right, now it's back to the way it was. Again, non-destructive. If I ever want to change my mind, this is a way out. And this is why layers are so critical in every step of the way. Always think of these first when it comes to editing your photos so that you work non-destructively. Next up, we've got effects. These are layer effects, and these are great for certain things like glows. Let's go ahead or a stroke. Well, okay, let's do a stroke. Stroke is basically just a solid outline, whereas a glow is a diffused outline. But let's go ahead and size this stroke up. We'll give it a color. Again, don't worry about the details here. I'm going through this quickly just because I want to show you what's possible. All right, so now I have gone ahead and I've added this orange outline to the fleur-de-lis shapes, the red and the black. Okay, and I'm going to take the opacity up solid to 100% so you can see it better. There it is. And here's the size. And you notice I can adjust the size real quickly and easily. So there's how fat it is. There's how wide that outline is. I can put it on the center. I can put it on the inside or the outside. To clean it up, I'm going to put it on the inside and just make it so it only goes inward and not outward. And there we go. So now I've got a stroke. There's a lot of other things like drop shadows you can add, and we're going to get into those later. But for now, just realize that, yes, okay, I've just stroked the entire group, which is different than had I done it individually to the individual layers. You notice that it's applied to the entire group, not the layers themselves, not the individual layers. So it's tracing their outlines and creating that orange stroke on it. All right, this gives me an opportunity now to show you how this little fill slider works that I skipped over earlier. When I drop down the fill, what happens is I take out the inside, but I leave the layer style alone. So that gives me this opportunity to leave the stroke. So if I want to do something like that, I've created this sort of outline shape, but the interior is transparent. So that's just a cute little trick you can do with Photoshop that not many people are aware of. All right, we're going to wrap this thing up soon because I know you're probably absorbing too much information. I'm throwing a lot at you, I know, but I just really want you to get a sense of this. So next up is linking. This allows you to link layers together without using folders. And so, for example, if I wanted to link these two layers together, I can hold down the Shift key to select multiple layers and then use the linking option. This is a way that you can group things together without using folders. So I can send some elements or edit two elements of this at the same time. So when I move them, you notice they move together because of that link. I'm going to undo that, but yeah, that's just as simple as that. And I probably should have mentioned this earlier, but it's kind of obvious maybe, but maybe it's not to some of you. When I click a layer, you notice that it highlights. And I do want to point out that one of the most common mistakes people make in Photoshop is not being aware of which layer is selected when they start working. So they start working and things aren't going right, or they get an error message, or a tool doesn't work that it's supposed to. 9 times out of 10, I've come over to help, or I send an email out and I ask people, are you aware of what layer you have selected? Because people just forget. It's natural. You're working on one layer and then you forget, and then you think you're working on, let's say, for example, the shape layers here. And in reality, I've got layer 1 selected. So I start painting and I'm trying to paint the fleur-de-lis. And when I go to paint, that's not working. I'm only painting on the background layer, which, in this case, it won't show up. So let me try that again. There we go. So now I'm painting on the photo, and I'm like, whoa, it didn't paint on the fleur-de-lis shapes. It didn't paint on the shape group. That's because it was just painting on the linked layers below. So that's not what I wanted, but just to let you know that is definitely a source of confusion for people. So always be aware of what layer you have selected. And that's easy enough to check for. Just got to get in the habit of doing it. Along those lines, when it comes to grouping, this is something they've added more recently in Photoshop. They've added this feature where you can search for types of layers or show and organize by showing certain types of layers. So again, this is a feature you're probably only going to want to use when you have lots and lots of layers. But of course, if you had 50, 60 layers, maybe even 20, this could be really useful for finding a layer you're looking for. So you can search by flipping this switch on, and it will filter according to the types of layers that you want. So if I turn this on, and it's on by default, by the way, I'm going to go ahead now and just show only the layers that are, let's say, for example, pixel-based layers. Well, in this case, that's not really going to do much because they're all have. Let's go ahead and make a new type of layer so we can demonstrate this better. I'm going to create a text layer. So many types of layers. And yes, we will get into all of these. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and move this up on top so you can see it better. But let's do that. I'm going to go ahead and put this at the very top here. There we go. There's my little hello text. Put it there. All right, so now let's say, for example, I had tons of layers and I wanted to find only the text layers. I can click on that. You notice everything disappears except for the text layer. All right, they're still there. It's just that when I'm looking for something, this makes it a little bit easier to find it. You'll notice that this switch becomes red to let me know that, oh, I'm hiding layers, the visibility of layers. So that's what this is all about. So there's an option for adjustment layers, for pixels, shape layers, etc. And so as we go deeper into Photoshop, you'll see the different types of layers that come about from doing different projects and using different things. But this really is a way for you to filter those by kind. Now, there's also other methods. You can filter by name. So you can do, use this like a search engine, basically. Attributes, color. There's all kinds of ways that you can filter your layers so you're only seeing certain layers. So that's what this bar is all about. think of it as kind of a search engine for layers or an organizational tool. Now, last but not least, in the upper right corner here, we've got this button, this little icon that allows you, I'm going to move this over so you can see this, to do a lot of specialized things with layers, okay? And I just want to point this out. Again, this is something we'll be using from time to time. Some of this is a duplicate of what is already in the buttons that I showed you. Some of this is just like another way of doing it, like using a menu to do it. Say, for example, new layer. And other things can only be done here. Say, for example, things like converting to a smart object, which you cannot do with these other buttons. But there is another menu where you can do that, but this is a quick shortcut to it. And again, some duplicates like block layers. So there's features here that we'll use in the class that are like merging, for example, that are only possible via that menu. So I just wanted to point that out to you before I leave you, to let you know that that is definitely an option that is there. Okay, let's leave it there for now, and hopefully this is going to get over for you into the world of layers. And as I mentioned, we're going to dig deeper and deeper into the subject. Now, this what I've been doing here was to show and showcase these different tools. This is not something you need to follow or turn in. So don't worry about it. There's nothing to turn in for this exercise. But I would encourage you to go back and reference this if you have any doubts, or if you get to another lesson later on and you've forgotten what some of these tools do. It might be a good idea to review this from time to time throughout the semester and come back to it. So for now, I'll leave it at that and let you go on to the next tutorial.